States, right? Why would it be different? What are the fundamental differences between Latin America and the United States? And we can see that part of it is uh, the way that the countries are founded. Many scholars in Latin America say, well, this is an unfair question to ask, um, comparing the current United States to Latin America. There would probably be a closer parallel to the experience of Native Americans in the United States and Latin America, right? These are the native peoples, and how did they fare, right? How did they fare in this? So uh, that this would be a closer parallel than looking at the industrialized United States, founded by European immigrants who came with certain skills, certain aspirations, certain preparation, and mainly a mindset, right? That they came with a certain mindset of uh, this dynamic of growth, of economic organization that didn't exist in the indigenous societies. So, looking back at the foundation of Latin American countries, we could see that the colonial system fostered, um, first a monoculture, like a lack of diversity in economic activity, mining or plantation farming as a main economic activity, and really restricted any type of diversification or intercontinental trade, right? That the Spanish crown forced all trade to go through Spain. So they discouraged Peru from trading with Bolivia and Colombia, and the different countries from collaborating to maintain the power of the crown. So describe describe three of the legacies of colonialism that impacted the development of Latin American republics and continue to influence modern Latin America. Give specific examples from the experience of Latin American countries. So we could look at several. We could look at Mexico, or Peru, Cuba, or any of these, and we could see similar issues. So what would be three legacies? Let's think about this. So one would be the legacy of creating the monoculture, right? The production of one raw material, and this leads to the lack of diversity, the focus on that one, and then out of that we could see slavery, which leads to racial hierarchies in Latin America. Um, the Spanish believed in the concept of purity of blood, pureza de sangre, that your beginnings, your genealogical beginnings would influence what you could do in society. So we see the society being broken down and stratified racially. Also, the bringing of millions of Africans to the Americas really changes the nature of Latin American society and creates a series of issues. Dependency, the concept of dependency, that the colonies were not encouraged to diversify or become self-sufficient, but rather be dependent, and this is something that continues. What would be some other legacies? The church, right? We could look at the Catholic Church and the way the Catholic Church has transformed and also shaped Latin American societies, at least moral codes.
National debts.
National debts, right? We could look at language, right? This is the legacy of colonialism, the imposition of the Spanish language, and what are the impacts of that. So is this clear? Yeah. So again, the question rises also, why America, right? So the author asks in the very beginning of why Latin America, the question of who is an American. So if you say, for instance, if you go to Latin America and you tell someone, if you go to Argentina and you tell someone, I'm an American, what are they going to answer you? What are they thinking about you when you make that answer?
We're all Americans.
We're all Americans. They're thinking you are a supreme idiot, right?
Yeah.
Because we're all Americans. Well, I'm an American too, so can you be more specific, right?
Well, I'm North American.
Right.
From
Or
the
even
States.
someone from Canada. If you say I'm North American, what are they going to say, right? What are they thinking? Well, what am I, right? We're North Americans also. So kind of embedded in this concept, in this question, is a certain arrogance that's embedded in our language, in our culture here. And I go through this with students all the time. I'm teaching in a doctoral program, and they're still talking about Americans and not taking into account the whole continent. And we can see that people in Latin America are very aware of this. So it's almost like they lay a little quicksand trap for you, and they'll ask you a very innocent question to see if you fall in, right? To see who are you, right? What kind of person are you? Because throughout Latin America, this is very present, and the U.S. control through Manifest Destiny and other policies over Latin America is very apparent and very obvious, and becomes, as we'll see later, a big factor in Latin American politics. That opposition to the United States becomes a rallying point all through Latin American history because of the U.S. interference in Latin American political affairs. So let me just stop here for a second. So what would a right answer and a wrong answer look like? A correct answer would be one that cites examples from the text and from the videos and the other material that we're using. So a wrong answer would be one that would be vague and general without giving any specific examples and details. Okay? So let's say you don't agree with the book. That's fine. But you should cite what they say and explain why it's wrong.
Prove that you did the work and you didn't just make this up.
Right. And there could be many ways that you could criticize this book, and many people do. That this is a very mainstream textbook, and that they're playing it very safe by trying not to take one side or another, which means that they're holding this middle ground. They're mentioning other theories and perspectives all through the book. And one of the keys to the book, and they keep mentioning, are two kind of warring perspectives that they've now said neither of these is actually valid, which is the dependency theory and modernization theories. And these go to this first question, and these theories come out in both kind of emerging in the 1950s. The question of why Latin America? Why do we study Latin America? So what happens after World War II is that the U.S. banking system and financial sectors realize that they can make more money by investing outside of the United States than in the United States. That they can hedge their bets. They can kind of have the best of both worlds by investing in, for instance, after World War II, U.S. bankers invest in the economies, rebuilding the economies of Europe, rebuilding European industry, Japanese industry, and through this, they're able to gain fantastic profits despite the downturns in the United States. There's constant depressions and recessions, and investments are going up and down, but investing in foreign countries is a safe bet because they're guaranteed a certain return, a very high rate of return, and also rebuilding the economies. As those economies rise, the U.S. bankers benefit from this. So they realize that this is a good thing to do, and they begin looking for other places to invest. Where else can we build industry? And they see Latin America. But what are the problems of investing in Latin America? Why would people be hesitant in the 1950s to invest huge amounts of money in Latin America? Frequent unstable governments, right? Reading this is just a litany, one after another, of coups and conspiracies and corruption. So there's little stability. Also, creating industry in a country, what do you need to create industry? What's the first thing you need?
Roads.
You need an infrastructure, right? You need roads, you need energy, you need an education system, because what's the difference between peasants and workers? They need to be skilled, right? They need to know how to read and write. Do not place hand in front of saw, right? You need to be able to read that sign, right? And things like this. So you need an infrastructure, you need an administrative system, and so that these are things that seem very difficult. Also, you need a customer base. In most of Latin America, huge majority of the people earn no money, virtually no money. So there's no market for these goods. If you build industry, who's going to buy this stuff? You need to also distribute wealth more equally, right? And where's the pressure coming? Why is this instability? Because elites are trying to hold on to this hereditary power that they've inherited and maintained over the years against the social movements that are emerging. So modernization theory argues, and this is something that kind of supported and was encouraged by the U.S. financial sector, that encourages the study of Latin America to be able to answer these questions. How do we make these changes in Latin America without a revolution? How do we create democracy, democratic institutions that will give rise to stability? So the idea is through industry, through modernization, and this is something that is followed through Latin America. And we see in the 1950s a huge push towards modernization and huge foreign investment in Latin America. So the theory argues that, similar to the United States, as industry grows, as people now have jobs and are tied to the larger economy, they're also going to demand services from the government. You're working at a job, working in industry, people moving from the country to the city, the growth of these urban centers, people working at jobs, paying taxes for the first time. We see the growth of a national treasury, something that really didn't exist because few people were paying taxes in Latin America. So also, as people get jobs, what happens?
They spend money.
They spend money and they form unions, right? New power centers grow. And they demand things in exchange for their taxes. We need streetlights, we need water, we need this, we need that. And they begin to have common interests. And we see with unions, what do those union members do? They vote. And they demand things. So we see the growth of civil society in Latin America. So the argument is that the growth of industry is going to lead to a more equal distribution of wealth and the growth of democratic institutions. And they would prove this. For instance, who's the president of Brazil right now? Dilma Rousseff. And
maybe until tomorrow.
right. But her successor will also be a socialist. What does it mean to have a socialist president of Brazil who believes in the ideas of Karl Marx, who believes in the elimination of private property? What does that mean? Did democracy work? Did democracy emerge that they could, after many coups and overthrows of presidents, and that now they're allowing a socialist president?
Democracy didn't work.
It didn't work, or did it work?
Did it?
It got better.
Well, they allowed that. This would have never happened before. The generals would have stepped in and said, "There's no way you're taking power."
I grew up with that.
So why doesn't Dilma Rousseff? Why doesn't she do what she believes in? How would you resolve the problem of inequality of wealth and eliminate poverty in Brazil? What would be one really easy way?
Redistribution of wealth.
You would, like in many socialist countries, say, okay, like monopoly, okay, you guys have had fun, you had boardwalk all this time, now it's time to hand in the cards, let's reshuffle the deck, and now you get Baltic Place, right? You had the mansion, now you get the shack, and somebody else gets the mansion. Or your 10 mansions, you only really need one, let's divide up the others. So why doesn't she do this? Because of economic forces, and that she's not able to do that. By being elected president, she's tied to a constitution, a series of laws and norms, And no matter how she would like to do things, she's tied. She can't. So, did democracy produce the change that maybe, yes
Yes.
and no, right? Yes and no, that she is president, but the president is also dependent on the rest of the world. She can't make the types of changes that maybe she would like to, right?
And there's a lot to do with education as well.
Right, exactly. So did modernization theory work? Was it did we prove it? That modernization leads to the growth of democratic institutions and more equitable distribution of wealth?
Depends, I think. In
It
theory,
depends on
because-
how, in theory, so you could look at it one way, but is wealth more equitably divided in Brazil?
Yes, well, a little bit more credit. than they
So
have, right?
yes and no, right? That okay, the median income of Brazilians went up. Does that mean that all Brazilians are better off than they were? Or are there 24 Brazilian billionaires?
Yes, that's the
So,
gap.
so many things happen. A middle class emerges, right, through industry and jobs, but the poor got poorer and the rich got richer. So, many of these things. So again, what the book is talking about, kind of the problems with these overreaching theories. Also, we see in the midst of this, in 1964, a military coup. Right, the military steps in, so that because the path to industrialization is not easy, right? It requires roads, dams, education system, a series of major national projects, which are very difficult to carry out under a democracy. Who might be against dams and roads and schools and things like that? Well, some of the people that live there, the landowners, the indigenous people, many people might not be in agreement. So what happens, we see that these theories, the book is looking at how these theories might be useful guides, where you could see how investment bankers might need some theory to risk their investment, someone to say that if you do this, the outcome might be that. But they're not that useful as social scientists, because as easily as we could prove it, we could disprove it. So it's true and it's not true at the same time, depending on how the variables that you take into account. Latin American theorists putting forward the dependencia or dependency theory, that the growth of industry and modernization actually leads to the growth of bureaucratic authoritarian governments. Leads to further dependency, which would be, okay, here we have a socialist president of Brazil, but she can't do anything, right? That doing something to transform the society would lead to hostility and aggression from the world banking system and financial markets, as we see in Venezuela, right? Later when we get to Venezuela, we'll see how Hugo Chavez, seeking to transform the society, runs into a bunch of problems because he's a legally elected president who has to respect the Constitution and international banking norms, and only because of the oil wealth is he able to do this, right? And we see what's going on now, facing a lot of problems. So the book looks at these theoretical perspectives and is constantly kind of going back and forth to looking, well, one group might look at it this way and another group might look at it that way, right? So this is something that you can bring into your own answers, of deciding which one you agree with or not, that the answer might be somewhere in the middle or more towards this or more towards that. Again, and new perspectives and new theories have arisen recently to describe the rise of social movements and the rise of left-wing governments in Latin America. That neither of these two theories really explain that adequately, right? So the next question, how did the Mexican Revolution transform Mexican society? What were the principal causes and outcomes? Why did the Zapatistas rise up in the 1990s? What were their goals and objectives? So this is a very broad question. and would lead to looking at the roots of the Mexican Revolution, why it happened, and why it reoccurred in the 90s, again, an insurrection. So to answer this question, you can look at the roots of colonial Mexico, the rise of the Porfirio Diaz presidency or regime, again, and how forces in Mexico came together. And again, the Mexican Revolution, the first revolution in the 20th century that really, destroyed the institutions, the economic and political foundation of Mexico. But was the revolution successful? Was it successful? What do you think?
Yes.
Okay. If, depending on how you frame the question, right? If the idea of the revolution was to overthrow the dictatorship, to create land of liberty and bread, right, and justice, were these things accomplished? To a certain degree, right? The people are freed from slavery. The role of the Catholic Church is lessened. 90% of Mexico is living in debt peonage at the time of the revolution. They're living on haciendas as virtual slaves, tied by debt that's passed on from generation to generation, and this cycle is broken. But is there a radical transformation of society, a massive redistribution of wealth and resources? No. So some of the goals were achieved, but not all of them. And also if you look at the implementation. So many of these concepts of the Mexican Revolution are enshrined in the Mexican Constitution, and you can look at Article 27 that they talk about here. Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution allows the creation of communal lands and the redistribution of lands, right? That the government can confiscate land and distribute it. And this leads to the creation of the ejido, the communal lands, right? The ejido is the foundation of the modern Mexican society. And what's the difference between communal land and public land? Like Golden Gate Park, is that communal land?
No, it's public land.
It's public land. And what's the difference?
Anybody can go there?
Anyone can go there, but can you plant corn there?
No.
No. So it's that you can participate in it, you have use of it within boundaries, right? You can't camp there, there's a bunch of things you can't do. But communal land would be more like the neighborhood garden. It's a space that's owned by and administered by a group of people, a certain membership. Not anyone can take part in, but a defined group. And this defined group can't buy or sell this land. So it creates, again, using the more indigenous concept of property rights and ownership, that this will be used for the benefit of this community, a determined community, not everyone, but the people that are members of this community. And not until 1934, with the Lázaro Cárdenas presidency, do we see land reform implemented. And Cárdenas gives away, I think, 50 million acres of land to ejidos, these communal land collectives, cooperatives. And the Zapatista uprising of the 1990s, we can see, is a response. It's not a coincidence that this occurs on the day that the NAFTA Free Trade Treaty is enacted, right? That this uprising is timed because the indigenous people of Mexico, especially in the state of Chiapas, see that part of NAFTA is the abolition of Article 27 and the dividing up of the communal lands. Now they become private property. So something that was a collective, was run by a cooperative, is now separate landowners. And what's the problem with this? if you have a cooperative that controls, say, 100 acres or 500 acres, what happens, and there's 50 members, what happens when you divide that up? Well, what happens if one person sells their piece, right? And this wasn't allowed under the ejidos that kept this land, and this was also a safety valve. The ejido system was a safety valve so that Mexicans wouldn't starve. Because what did people do on these ejido lands? They grew food, and people would not starve if they were growing the traditional corns, beans, and squash. But now with this, we see the competition from farmers in Idaho, in Iowa, who are growing corn and beans, and they're doing it with industrial machinery on a huge basis, genetically modified crops, etc. And the price of corn goes down, which makes it inefficient to grow these things in Mexico. So the NAFTA free trade treaty is seen by the Zapatistas as a death blow to their culture. That now, if it's no longer profitable to grow corn in Mexico, what are people going to do? What are they going to eat? This is the basis. Corn is seen as the basis of the Mexican diet. And now you see the influx of diabetes and things like this because the genetically modified corn doesn't have the same nutrients that the traditional corn has, and the way that it's grown, etc. So is this question clear?
Yes.
So you look at how the Mexican Revolution transformed Mexican society. What are the principal causes and outcomes, right? What were the problems and what were the outcomes? And how this continues in the 1990s. So if you watch the film The Sixth Son, that's posted there, and look at the chapter, I think this will answer the question. Especially The Sixth Son will explain a lot about the Zapatista movement. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. What were some of the causes and outcomes of Central American revolutions in Nicaragua and El Salvador? What was the role of liberation theology in these revolutionary movements? So, in this you would look at the rise, the way that Nicaragua and El Salvador were formed, and there's a lot of similarities we can see is that a few families become powerful, that the descendants of the Spanish land grants continue to control vast areas, and after the independence, we see the growth of the new republics, that not much changes in terms of the distribution of land and resources. We see the growth in both of these countries of in the 1960s, revolutionary movements beginning, right? All through Latin America. This is something very common all through Latin America. After the 1959 Cuban Revolution, people in Mexico and all over Latin America begin to see that maybe there's another alternative, right? To follow the example of Cuba, and we can see a lot of support for this from Cuba and from other parts of Latin America to rise up. Armed struggle seems like a possibility. And in both Nicaragua and El Salvador, we see the rise of revolutionary movements that begin to challenge the government, because we see, why would people take up arms? Because they see there's no other alternatives. They can't run for office. And we see the example of El Salvador, where the reform elements being denied taking power, and the Communist Party being banned, etc. So that what would be normally a reform movement or an opposition movement is made impossible, which pushes people then how do you resolve the problems? If you're living in a repressive country with no system of justice and no adequate representation, then what do you do? So people come to this conclusion in both places, and we see the role of liberation theology in these revolutionary movements is how do you talk to people with very little schooling about Marxist ideology and about revolutionary transformation? What are the things that they know about? How do people see the world? Again, much of the schooling and the training that people have comes from the Catholic Church. The concepts of good and evil, this balance beam, right? What's good, what's evil? What's the root of all evil? Money, materialism, greed, right? Oppression of other people. So if you take these religious concepts and apply them to politics, we can, as we see in the liberation theology movement, they're encouraging people to take what was originally meant as a form of self-reflection, using the moral codes and the lessons in the Bible. If you apply these to everyday life and begin to look at the larger society using these concepts, what are the conclusions you come to? You look, okay, Christ, why was he crucified? What did he do? He was a rebel. What did he think about greedy people, rich people, materialists that would try to accumulate property and goods?
They were bad.
They were bad. This was bad. So when they begin to look around them and apply these concepts, using the Bible as a guide for revolutionary activity, this has a huge impact because they're able to explain a complex political ideology through religion. So if you look at Christ as a revolutionary, Christ becomes syncretized with Che Guevara, right? Who's proposing something very similar, that things should be more, there should be justice, there should be a means of redistributing wealth, and that material concerns shouldn't be the overriding factor in developing a society. So the liberation theology movements become huge all over Latin America, but especially in Central America, play a strong role. And in this chapter, you'll see some of the aspects of this. Also in the film, The Sixth Son, we see that Bishop Samuel Ruiz talking about liberation theology and talking about how Catholicism and the grassroots, the role of the grassroots priest in explaining the world to people and how this becomes the basis of revolutionary activity. So is this clear? So again, and if we look at the outcomes, we can see who is in power in Nicaragua and El Salvador today. The guerrilla movements, or the transformed guerrilla movements. The Sandinistas who fought the revolution and won in 1980 and then were deposed are now in power again. In El Salvador, who's in power? The FMLN, the ex-guerrilla force, is now in power. But are they the same people they were when they were fighting? Are their goals the same? They're kind of in the same situation as the president of Brazil, that there's not so much they can do. They're, through electoral means, they're really not able to transform the country in the way that they might want to.
But there's also the influence of the United States, for example, like, if they were to do what Venezuela is doing, that's where Venezuela is today, with all the blockades and the economics, and so they really can't transform as their principles were, and so they're kind of stuck in the middle.
They're stuck in the middle, and so that they're trying to make things more equitable on one hand, but they also have to deal with capitalism.
But they're corrupt as well.
Well, and we can see that corruption enters the scene here. And this is another analysis, because what happens when you're a leader in a capitalist country, and what's the colonial tradition? Again, you could look back to colonialism.
So that's exactly what it is. In Brazil, it's like, Dilma came with all those principles and she's corrupt people. And the next one that is going to come in, can't govern. I mean, she just all this stuff.
It becomes difficult, because we can see that kind of the basis of colonialism is that supporting your friends and your family is what it's all about. And people actually look to a strong leader. Why? Because they're going to get it done. And if you're on their good side, everything's good. And if you're on your bad side, then it's all bad,
Yeah,
right?
if everyone's getting a little bit, things are good.
So this is the tradition. So we could also look, for instance, when the Spanish created the colonial system, the colonial administrative system, which the legacy of this continues as these administrative systems are the foundation of what we see in Latin America. If you had a job, for instance, you're the dog catcher of Mexico City, are you paid a salary? No. How did you get your money then? From people, right? You find dogs and you kind of ransom the dogs back to the owners, or the police chief, right? Or any of the government function. They were really not paid a salary, but were expected to extract money from the populace. And this idea continues. So for instance, people look at the corrupt policeman in Mexico, we can see as an example. A policeman stops you for a traffic infraction and says, okay, you didn't signal the left turn 100 feet before the stop sign, so I've pulled you over, and I'm going to take your license, and you'll have to go to the police station and pay the fine and get your license back. Now, is that a hassle? Huge hassle. Or you could say, but officer, I'm so busy and I have to go to school and this and that and that. How about if I gave you some money and you pay the fine for me? He said, okay, you seem like a decent person. I can do that for you. So here's a transaction, and both sides know what the real story is. But is this justified? Did the policeman save the person the hassle of doing that? And we're kind of doing them a favor? Well, and I mean, it depends how you look at it, right? It depends how you look at it. What if you had to go to did you commit the infraction? Maybe you did or maybe you didn't. But still, that there's this acknowledgement on both sides of how the system works. And people, by doing this, are accepting it. What if you said, no way, I'm not going to accept this bribe, give me the fine, and I'm going to go to the police station? Well, what if you get to the police station and they say, oh, we can't find your license. It's not here. I don't know what happened to it.
You just threw it away.
Or something, right? So one way or another, you're going to end up paying that, right? So all these things that we can see is part of this system of corruption that begins ingrained in the system, the idea of the caudillo, of the strong man, the strong leader, that really doesn't go away. That becomes reinforced over and over and transformed over time. And we can see, for instance, people look at Daniel Ortega, the current president of Nicaragua, who was a revolutionary in the 70s and the 80s, and now has transformed into something else. And we could look at the case of El Salvador and what's going on there. So this leads us into the next question. How has the United States foreign policy impacted the development of Central American societies? So we can see several things here. One is U.S. intervention in Nicaragua really supported these corrupt and unequal societies, the development of them, by supporting and giving support to the landowners, the business owners, again, against popular uprisings, and supporting the U.S. investment in mining plantation systems, especially the United Fruit Company, which had vast agricultural holdings in Latin America.
So the overriding reason that they did, because they're protecting
and this was very clear. So how did this impact the development of Latin American societies? Well, the constant intervention in especially in Nicaragua, we can see, led to the stifling of what might have been a natural progression, the growth of social movements, the growth of oppositional groups. And we can see in the 1980s, the U.S. intervention into the political scene creates, for instance, why did the Nicaraguan revolution Why were they voted out of power? Well, the U.S. support for the Contras, the U.S. support for the military in El Salvador gives support to groups which might not have been able to continue, and inhibits the growth of social movements that eventually are the ones that create stability. So we can see that in El Salvador, for instance, who won the war? Who won? Did the guerrillas win, or did the government and the army win? Who won? Here's a civil war. Who won?
Guerrillas.
Well, really nobody won. Nobody won. Did the guerrillas take power through military means, right? Did they march in with their guns? No, they were forced to negotiate. They were forced to negotiate, so civil society comes and says, basically, we don't want, they forced the government to make concessions. So they're saying, we don't want the guerrillas to take over by force of arms, and we don't want the army to wipe them out either. That you have to talk. The answer is somewhere in the middle. So this is where the emergence of civil society, and also through the influence of the United States, that this war and this conflict is not helping business, that there needs to be some concession. So now the FMLN is in power, but not in the way that they would have liked to have been, because now they're stifled by these rules and this constitution that doesn't allow them to make the changes. But one of the outcomes also, we could see that the war and the conflict in Central America sends many people to the United States as refugees. Right? Central Americans all through the 80s coming to the United States as refugees, fleeing the war, conflict, political violence. They're on one side or the other. And what happens from this? People coming, especially from El Salvador to Los Angeles, to other places. And what happens to these young people? Thrown into this new place. Well, many of them join gangs. They're living in poor neighborhoods. They're many of them traumatized by the war. And as the United States, the hysteria over immigration grows, we can see that many of these people that commit crimes, immigrants that commit crimes, are deported. And what happens when you deport thousands of people who have been in prison, who have been in gangs, back to El Salvador? The gangs are transported, and we can see the problems that El Salvador is facing now, partly through the U.S. foreign policy that displaced the support for the military, prolonged this conflict, and we can see that people are displaced, sent back, and now we see these huge gangs, which are now operating here. So that is one of the main problems that's facing El Salvador right now, is this, not only the economic and political instability, but violence, random violence. So is this clear? Yeah. So again, you can look through the chapters, you can look at other information, but again, answering with details. Answering using details, using examples to look at this. Describe the impact of the Cuban Revolution on Cuban society. How did the revolution address many of the historic problems facing Latin American countries? How did this revolution influence other Latin American countries? So I think this one is pretty clear, and you can watch the film Fidel that's there, which talks about with Fidel Castro's participation in what, again, this is in first-person interview with Fidel, where he's explaining in his own words what he was trying to do and why. He talks about this in very clear terms. So what are some of the things that the revolution did to address historic problems facing Latin American countries? What was different about their approach? Well, we can see one of the first things that they do is address land reform by giving out thousands of acres, expropriating foreign properties and expropriating private property in general and businesses, and redistributing land and resources.
Beginning with his family.
Right,
Estate.
his own family's estate
Well,
and many others, right?
But today, he's got more land than everybody playoffs. I mean, I was there just in January, and his compound is huge, right?
Right.
In Nirvana. So, did it work really?
Well, so, but how did they address the historic problems? By reshuffling the deck, by confiscating land and redistributing land, by creating an equal educational system, right, giving people access. And you can criticize the Cuban Revolution for many reasons, but people will say that there is an educational system, there's health care, housing, things like this. So, so one of the ways that they addressed the historic problems was to, again, educate people, to give people the tools to be able to participate in modern society, to redistribute land and wealth, to create a social infrastructure, a social welfare program, to also rewrite Cuban history, to begin to create a kind of a new historical and cultural portrait of Cuba, again, who Cubans are. And this is something very unique in Latin America, that they were able to put in the resources into creating new cultural institutions that really redefine the national identity and provide a methodology for people in other Latin American countries to explore their own roots. So you'll see that all through Latin America, Cuba becomes a center for not only revolutionary ideas, but also for cultural research, as it becomes crucial to identify in coming into the 1960s with the growth of the mass communication, is to reinforce and to document folk cultures and history, because as the 60s produces massive changes and migrations of people moving from one place to another, in this, many of the folk cultures and the roots of traditional cultures being uprooted. When people moved from the country to the city, what happens? What do they leave behind? Do they bring everything with them? A lot of stuff is left behind. And in that, so these things need to be documented and understood and incorporated into the curriculum. So how did the revolution influence other Latin American countries? Well, I think this is pretty clear, that the ideas that Che Guevara is proposing is that this revolution that happened in Cuba could be repeated in other countries. And here's a manual of how to do it. And proposing to all Latin American countries that the way that people rose up in Cuba could happen in other places. So, again, one of the things that Cuba did early on, something that changed later, was to try to export revolution, both by encouraging and supporting revolutionary groups, and later by providing a model. By educating, providing schools for Latin Americans, again, to see and try to emulate the Cuban model. So the next one, how has Cuba been able to sustain its revolutionary government despite challenges from the United States and the fall of the Soviet Union? What are the forces that continue to sustain the revolution? So I just posted another article that'll help you answer this question, called Cachita y el Che. I just put it up on the site. And this is an interesting article written by a Cuban-American sociologist from the University of New Mexico, Nelson Valdez. And what he proposes is, with the fall of the Soviet Union, he asks the question, with the fall of the Soviet Union, as the whole socialist bloc disappears, why didn't the revolution fall apart? Cubans facing starvation after the fall of the Soviet Union, industry is paralyzed, buses stop running, garbage trucks are pulled by oxen, people facing malnutrition. Why didn't the revolution fall? What were some of the reasons? What held it together? How did socialism survive in Cuba when it didn't in all these other countries, right, throughout the Soviet bloc? And Cuba, one of the most dependent countries on the Soviet Union. Why didn't it fall? And he argues in this article, and you could look at other arguments also, but Valdez argues that the Afro-Cuban culture the Afro-Cuban spirituality, the mixture of African religions and Catholicism that becomes the strength or the backbone of Cuban culture. And that people in Cuba begin to look around them. What would capitalism look like in Cuba? Would it look like Switzerland or Haiti? How would things go for Cubans, especially black Cubans, if capitalism returns to Cuba? Bad. They might look at the experience of black people in other countries. How has that been, right? They might look at the way capitalism has developed in other Caribbean countries. Let's look at Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica. How's that going? Would you like to live like this? So we can see that people, again, the process of education has given people the analytical tools to look around them. Also, we can see that what Nelson Valdez argues is that the process of syncretism that fuses the Afro-Cuban religions with Catholicism also has the same effect on socialism. What are some of the principles of every religion? Treat others well, don't be greedy, follow these moral codes of behavior. And we can see that many of these same principles are also incorporated into the ideals of socialism. And as these become fused, we can see a grassroots community forms, community networks, which are able to sustain a bankrupt political system, right? As people, who do they look for help? Do they look to the government?
Themselves.
They look to their neighbors and their friends and their family. And so that, again, this process of kind of this fusion allows people to say, well, we can survive. We can survive this without giving up the revolution, without bringing back the people from Miami, who many people in Cuba associate. Again, the experience of slavery is not that far away. Slavery ends in 1880 in Cuba. And they're saying, well, do we bring back the descendants of the slave masters? Do we bring back the dependency that we lived under? Or do we can this evolve? And we can see now the evolution of the system. And coming with it, with bringing back elements of capitalism, we see the inequitable distribution of wealth again arising, right? That some people are getting more. We see tourism coming in and all the problems that come with tourism. People, the big hotels and casinos and resorts before the fall of the Soviet Union, who stayed in those places? Cuban workers. Sugarcane cutters, after a long season of cutting cane, could go relax on the beach for 2 weeks in a paid vacation, right? In these luxury resorts. Now, who's there? Tourists, Canadians,
The wealthy.
and Cubans are not allowed these things. So again, this inequality comes back, but again, people, because of the educational system, because of this new analysis that emerges, that people are able to weigh their options in a way that maybe people in other parts of Latin America are not. You could also look at political repression in Cuba. Doesn't allow a dissident voice or an oppositional force. And so these are some of the things you could look at. So is this clear?
So you can go both ways. Focus, yes, from like a revolution, it worked, but did it really work? An analysis around, because that's what I'm at. I mean, and from all the parts that Cuba is the one that interests me the most. It's because yes, it's different. They stood up for the United States for so long, but did it really work? Like today, in what they have, is it better than the opposite, like DR, for example? I mean,
Yeah.
it's conflicting.
So and this is what this course is about. I mean, one of the good things about taking an online course is you decide. I'm not asking you to repeat what I think or what the book thinks, but you have to take all these elements and come to your own conclusions. So what I'm asking you to do is to base that on some examples. You could say that here are the factors and this is what I think. that it worked to this point, that they have education and healthcare, but the quality of life, are people happy? Are they
So that's valid analysis. I
a
just
valid
wanted-
analysis? And it depends on your own criteria. And you could see, I was just with Cubans this morning, and I think everyone is conflicted. That are you going to risk your life to oppose it, or are you just going to accept it and try to transform it from within?
I asked that question, and even talking to Cubans, they look around, they shush because there is this the security apparatus that's everywhere
Mhm.
that they can't really say bad things about the revolution. And on the TV, what shows on the TVs are the 50 years ago, like Castro Young, and that's every day on the newspaper saying the revolution works. And I'm looking, why do I have watching footage from like 50 years ago? And
Right.
it's interesting. That was so interesting to me to see that.
Well, and I think I think that most people's analysis of looking at all these things we've talked about is maybe most people will agree the answer lays somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
That it's not here and it's not there, that there's problems with this and there's problems with that. And the answer lies somewhere in the middle. And we can see now with left-wing governments arising all over Latin America that the civil society has come to that conclusion also. That we would like to try these ideas to have a government that is in theory in support of the people and working people and trying to bring a better life. But we don't want dictatorship. We want to have the ability to vote these people out whenever we want. And so we can see that again, the growth of civil society is this voice that's questioning these things. And left-wing governments being voted in and voted out, right? This is not working, guys. And then they come back in, another one comes back in saying, well, I'm going to try it from this other approach. Let's try this. So we can see that this is, I think, this is what the course is about, is to kind of make up your own mind and decide, form your own process of analysis given the tools. Here's what happened. These are the forces that are in play. And what do you think happened? So this would be a very correct answer, right? What are some of the historical legacies of colonialism in the Andes? How have recent movements in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador tried to address these issues? Give an example. So in this one, you can look at, again, going back to colonialism, what would the three countries have in common? What was one of the things that the colonial governments sought to get from those colonies? Why would the Spanish even bother?
Natural resources.
The natural resources, which was mainly minerals, right? So that many of the historical legacies of colonialism is the mining. Now, if we think about mining, is mining a very productive activity for a country? What is mining about? What do you do to mine something?
Taking it away here.
Yeah, you're extracting it, right? Is it coming back? No. You're digging up the earth and extracting the value and then putting back dirt, right? That will never grow anything. You're tearing down mountains and you're extracting. And not, does it put back? Agriculture, you grow and the soil continues. But mining, does the gold come back? The silver, the tin? No. So it's a very disruptive activity and a very exploitive activity which has many consequences. How about, is it fun being a gold miner? Being a tin miner? Coal miner? Do you think anybody really enjoys this task?
No.
Maybe panning for gold in a river, but not going down a dark hole, right? Slaving away in a dark hole where the earth could collapse on you and many things could happen, right?
That's
So-
one of the things. The colonialism is still there. The people that are doing that are uneducated people that can't find a better job, right?
Right, they can't find another job because there's no other activity.
Right.
That colonialism creates this economy that is based on the extraction of these materials, right? If given a choice, would people try to do something
Yeah,
else?
absolutely.
Maybe, but that's not an option because again, the assignation of Latin America as the producer of raw materials, the extraction of raw materials as the main economic activity creates a whole series of institutions that are very difficult to uproot, right? We also could see, for instance, in Peru, that is the seat of the vice royalty, we can see the imposition of the colonial culture, which has deep roots, right, in social hierarchies, racial hierarchies that really impede. And we look at kind of the evolution of the movements. We can see in Peru that many of these things, the growth, the descendants of the Spanish rulers or the administrators, these ideas and these moral codes and these kind of social institutions that are imposed in Peru are still very strong. I was in Peru, I've traveled there several times, and I noticed just in the house that I was staying in, the social hierarchies enforced in a very simple, fundamental way. I asked if the woman of the house is Susana home, and the person, the housekeeper, said, "No, la señora Susana no está. She's not here." But she made me realize that I had disrespected her by not giving her title, right? So each person had a title, and I noticed that they were going through a conflict of what title to give me, right? Was I Señor Gregorio or was I Don Gregorio? Where was my ranking in this? And then when I mentioned my education, then I became Doctor Gregorio, having a doctorate. Now I was placed in the social hierarchy. I asked, "Where is my son Andres?" And they said, "El joven Andres," the young Andres, "El joven Andres," again giving him a title and a ranking in the social hierarchy. And we could see that this is indicative of the whole society. Again, this legacy of colonialism, this social hierarchy, which is both reflected in racial divisions, class divisions, and just in the way that people think about society, about what's proper and what's not, have really changed. And if we look at the difference between the political evolution in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and Peru, again, in the book they ask, why Peru? Why was the experience of Peru different than Bolivia and Ecuador? We could see partly it could be in the strength of the colonial culture in Peru. As the head of the seat of the vice royalty, this was the seat of Spanish power. The existence of the silver mines and things like this, the wealth that could be extracted. So is this clear?
Yes.
Describe how the legacies of European racial hierarchies impacted modern Latin American societies. So this question, we have to look again. We can see the Spanish imposed a system of racial and ethnic hierarchies that put on the top peninsulares. And this was created to justify and ensure the Spanish power, peninsulares, people born in Spain. Under them, we have criollos. Who are criollos? The children of peninsulares, right? Directly. Under them, mestizos, mixed race people. And people's possibilities in society were determined by their ranking. And under this we would have, there were 38 categories, indios, and negros, and this is divided between all of the different possibilities of mixture between these 38 categories in some countries. And how are these enforced? How could you tell the difference between an indio and a mestizo?
Skin color?
Probably not. You couldn't probably, in many cases, the physical characteristics would not be indicative. Because someone might be mestizo because they had a European ancestor
Right.
6 generations back or 5 generations back.
So is Creole full-blooded peninsulars, that two of them are born in the land.
Right.
Because
Mhm.
that would make them full-blooded peninsula.
Right,
but
or
because-
children of criollos would be also criollos. So we can see that this enforced a system where people would try to marry up, right, and to better the family line. So it also imposed that certain positions could only be held by certain people of certain lineage. Now, how could you enforce this? How would you know who someone is? Through the church. Because there was not much mobility, neither social mobility or physical mobility. That people lived on the haciendas. They were basically peons in most parts of Latin America. That it was very difficult to move from one place to another. And because of the Inquisition and many of the rules of the church, baptism was key. If you didn't have a baptismal certificate, you didn't exist, right? So in your baptismal certificate, it would say who your mother is and who your father is, and they would be listed. So the church would assign this, right?
Oh, the title, actually?
Yeah, they would assign again, your mother is so-and-so, who's India, and your father is so-and-so, who's a mestizo, and that would make you this other category that's
In your
somewhere in
certificate.
between. On your certificate. So this was a way of enforcing this and also imposing these kind of abstract definitions, which would follow you through your life. So what are the continuation? How has this impacted modern Latin American societies? So how might you answer this question? Where would you look? In all the examples that we've seen, all through.
Socioeconomic as well. I mean,
Right, so who's still on the bottom?
there's
And
the
who's
mestizos,
still
the
on the top?
blacks,
Right?
The whites.
Right. Are these people on top?
No.
No. These people are still on top.
But
How? Mm-hmm.
in Brazil, which is very mixed, everyone is a little bit of everything, but I'm white in Brazil, but I have black blood. So there's different, I think the
Right, but in the Spanish system, you'd be one of these these categories in here that would describe mixed race people. For instance, in Cuba, you would be called habao. Habao is kind of unknown, right? With mixtures of blood and things that's not apparent from your physical, or mulatto, or trigueño, or castizo. There's many categories that were invented to kind of categorize people, and also to differentiate them from the ideal, which was pure white of European lineage, pure European lineage. Mhm.
So peninsulares, they were specifically they were born in Spain.
They were born in Spain.
So you had two peninsular parents moved to Peru. You couldn't be that.
No, if you were born in Spain, then you were peninsular. If you were born in the New World, then you're a criollo.
Okay.
So
Despite your parents.
despite your parents, and we can see, going back, that a lot of work and care taken to preserve these family lineages, because through this comes privilege and position. So it becomes very important to continue these lineages, and the idea of having peninsulares in charge. What does this assure? Loyalty to the crown. And we can see people in Spain seeing this as an opportunity, right? I might be nothing in Spain, but I'm a big shot. Just because I was born in Spain, I could be the dog catcher, or I could have a position, an official position, because some of these could only be held by people of Spanish, born in Spain. Or I could marry somebody, a wealthy person, who just needs to get up the ladder, right? So we could see these still continuing, right? And this is a topic of all the telenovelas, right? This is a huge topic, and all the telenovelas are about people trying to fit into these hierarchies, and kind of all the confusion and drama related to, again, the pressure of the family to to move up, and your own ideas and your own passion. Again, and it's part of the dilemma that people still face.
So these names, they're all still to this day discussed amongst the people.
There's not really, not so much. As he was saying, these are things that have become more open. But again, the European families, you won't find any Peninsulares anymore. But the Criollos are very careful to maintain that lineage, this connection to European blood. Right? Still. And you'll see that how could, again, European immigration really stopped 100 years ago, but how do you see then in these mixed race societies people maintaining the European lineage? How do they do that? Well, it means that part of these prejudices are ingrained, and people take steps. Oh no, you're not going to marry that black guy or that mestizo person, you know. And so
very evident in Argentina. They think that they think that their lineage is so European that they want to maintain that, so they consider themselves more European than something.
And all through Latin America, you see this. Look at the billboards. Look at the ads. Do the billboards look like the people that buy the products? No. Again, so and this is an ongoing debate, and it's going on in Brazil. They just proposed affirmative action in Brazil. In this multiracial society, why do you need that? Well, some people were not getting all the things that they didn't have equal access because of the historical legacies of colonialism and prejudice. Again, we can see that some people didn't have equal opportunities.
Very hot topic in Brazil right now.
Yeah, huge topic. And people say, well, wait a minute, why should they have more opportunities? Why should you give them special play? The same argument that went on here in the 70s, right? So is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. What are some of the continuing challenges facing Latin American countries? How have the historical legacies of colonialism impacted Latin American societies? This is a very vague question with basically no wrong answer. So just pick one. And you could look at the legacies of colonialism, corruption, for instance. You could look at the stratification, racial stratification and social hierarchies. We could look at the role of the Catholic Church in Latin America. You could look at the monoculture and the traditions of dependency, how these things have continued. Is this clear? So anything that here that it's your chance to kind of propose these larger issues. So here's the hardest question, the last one. What's the topic of your research paper? Why is this topic important? This is to give you feedback and won't be graded. I don't know yet is not a valid answer. So what do? Well, you choose a topic that's interesting to you, something that's interesting to you. And one of the things that I propose, and I put it in there in the description of the paper, is you might want to try to find a primary source for your research. This makes you the historian. What's the difference between a primary source and a secondary source? What would a primary source be? What's the difference? Primary source is something that you come into contact directly. Someone you talk to, an artifact that you look at, something that you're coming into contact directly, where you're extracting the information, data, and analysis yourself. So how would you do this? How would you find a primary source to write about Latin America in the Bay Area? Talk to somebody. And who's somebody? Where would you find that somebody that might be connected to one of these topics we're talking about in the course? Where would you find that somebody? Who would be a valid source?
Church.
Okay, church.
Community, someone.
In the community, a family member maybe, or a person you meet that's had an experience, and you kind of connect their own personal narrative to the larger historical context. Refugees. Where would you find refugees? All around you, right? Where would you find immigrants? Everywhere, all around you, right? Let's say you don't want to do that and you want to look at another, you might want to look at the Day of the Dead. It's coming up. Might be a fun way to do it. Here's a Latin American festival celebrated in San Francisco. What's that about? What does it come from? What are the roots? How does it take root here? How is it transformed? I'll send you an invitation. I take my students, my Diego Rivera class, on a field trip to the Day of the Dead in the March. And one year, it was kind of really interesting, almost shocking. Here we are standing on Cap and 24th, and we're watching the procession, people dressed like skulls and with altars, and talking about their ancestors, remembering their ancestors, participating in the traditional procession with candles. And all of a sudden, here we are, we're on Cap and 24th, a group of like 30 students, we're standing there, and the Burning Man procession joins the Day of the Dead. These are art cars and people with these crazy carts
Was
and
that insulting?
feathers and loud house music and things like that, and they're coming down Cap Street to join the parade, and they come through us, and we kind of see the contrast. Now, some of the students were outraged, like how dare they? But we're in San Francisco. So, and Day of the Dead, November 2nd, very close to Halloween. So there's kind of, and not that long after Burning Man. So it becomes this kind of hybrid event, fusing these three traditions. Halloween, Burning Man, and the Day of the Dead. So the mission becomes kind of this battleground, this cultural battleground where people kind of finding their own ways. Some people say, oh, it's a day to celebrate, like Cinco de Mayo. Like, what do you do on Cinco de Mayo? Drink lots of tequila. Does it have anything to do with what the holiday is about or the celebration of this? People don't even know what it is. It's similar with the Day of the Dead. So again, there's a lot of things you could look at, a lot of factors, a lot of issues going on here about tolerance, diversity, the way Latin American culture becomes integrated into the society here, into the culture of San Francisco. If you would say, what's the main contribution of San Francisco to international cuisine? The burrito would probably be high on the list, besides Alice Waters and California cooking, but the burrito would probably be very high on the list. So anyway, so you can go to there's the Diego Rivera mural that's right here on campus, and there's a lot of stuff about that you could encounter that, and things going on all over the place. So is this clear? Okay, good. So thank you for coming, and give me your names so you can get extra bonus participation points for being here.